Chapter 36. The next morning, Gwendraeth James was at his desk early. Despite everything that had happened to him the night before, despite the complications with Anne Davies and Sandra Tahirovic, and perhaps even because of them, he was determined to get to the bottom of the series of events at Plas Wern Las. It seemed to him now that there were two legacies. The one privileged and sometimes deadly that belonged to Martin James and his family, and the other, equally as dark and full of obfuscations that had come to him through his own Uncle Edward. There was an edge to the last one, a nagging sense of obligations gone wrong and thwarted duty that still bothered him. It was as if he had to complete an investigation from which his uncle had ultimately been excluded. It had become personal. The murder of Henrietta James still reverberated after 50 years, and that had been accentuated by the death of Queenie Rogers. In the first context, the name of the vicar, Anthony James, kept cropping up in different ways, but there was nothing definite to tie one thing to the other. But was that why, for example, that Myrick Evans had posted the photo of the squat church tower on his corkboard all those years ago? Had he suspected something? And if so, how did this link with the brutal murder of the tattooed woman? And was all this linked with the fact that Samantha Merriam now lay in the cells down below, pleading guilty to a crime she almost certainly did not commit? When Harry Warden came in a little later, Gwendraeth, remembering what Anne Davies had told him about her mother's brief relationship with Wyndham Spencer James, and the fact that she'd gone to Yorkshire to have the child, had him check on any unmarried mothers' homes in the area, going back as far as he could. "Thanks, Chief," Harry Warden said, as soon as he was given his instructions. "What are you going to be doing?" "I'm going to talk to someone," Gwendraeth said. Then he left the office. It was warm enough in the drab room. It was warm enough, but its institutional atmosphere dominated everything. Samantha Merriam sat in the steel chair in front of the steel desk, her pale face framed by her dark frizzed hair. She seemed tired as she slumped forward with her left arm resting on the desk to support her chin. She seemed tired, but she did not seem afraid. "This time, I want you to tell me the truth," Gwendraeth James said. "I told you the truth last time." He didn't believe it for a moment. "Let's try again, shall we? Start from the beginning." So they went over it once more. The details were now familiar, and Gwendraeth listened hard for contradictions about what had happened that morning on the track leading to the rectory. But her account was meticulously the same, without changes, and that made him even more suspicious. Her solicitor, Merriam Griffiths, sat by her side the whole time without saying anything. Young, professionally meticulous, he seemed hard to gauge to Gwendraeth. Very different from the anxious young man with an injured elbow he had interviewed just a relatively short time ago. "Is there anything else, Inspector?" Gwendraeth had to admit to the solicitor that for the moment there wasn't. If he found his presence more than slightly arduous, then that was something he was going to have to live with. Merriam Griffiths had done nothing, after all. The fact that he'd been shot while in conversation with Martin James might have been no more than coincidence, despite the fact that Gwendraeth found it increasingly unlikely. The solicitor was not implicated, even if, the tendrils of the Plas Wern Las case were increasingly intertwined. "And my client may be excused." Gwendraeth had to consent to that too. On the way out to the interview room, he turned to Merriam, who was in the process of whispering something to Samantha Merriam, and he said, "Did you know there'd been a second shooting?" Gwendraeth immediately saw that he caught Merriam off guard. The professional front was punctured. "Well, yes, I'm friends with Fionn Roberts," the solicitor said. "Saw her the night after the accident." "What you saw was no accident," Gwendraeth said. "I think you know as well as I do. What you saw was deliberate, and I intend to find out who is responsible." When he got back upstairs to the office, Gwendraeth found Harry Warden surrounded by coffee cups and Mars bars, the way he always fueled his researches. He was holding up the desk telephone for Gwendraeth to answer. Gwendraeth took it and recognized the voice immediately. It was Anne Davies. "I have something to tell you," she said without preamble. But when he tried to press her for more information, she refused. "I've got to see you, Gwendraeth, and ask that," she told him. "I won't talk to anybody else." It was a beautiful November morning by the side of the river. Apart from the beech hedge that flanked the edge of the property belonging to Waterside, the remainder of the trees had now lost their leaves, and through the patterned winter starkness of black trunks and branches, Gwendraeth could see down to the river. The sound of water rushing over stones came to him as he rang the doorbell. Anne Davies was wearing her hospital uniform when she opened the door. Her short auburn hair was pushed back from her face, and her lipstick was slightly smudged. She seemed pleased to see him, but obviously concerned about something. She said, "I think you better come in." When Gwendraeth stepped into the large room, he saw immediately what had happened. Someone who had obviously known what they were doing had taken the place apart in expert fashion. Cushions, books and papers were scattered around the room, and 2 of the chairs were turned over and their Hessian bottoms torn out. Pictures had been lifted from the walls, and the contents of the chest of drawers strewn everywhere. He stood in the middle of the chaos, and he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "Scrimshaw skeleton," Anne Davies said, and Gwendraeth knew that this was no ordinary breaking, but the latest in the string of incidents that linked back to Plas Wern Las, and whose pattern was still being played out. She didn't even have to complete a sentence and tell him it was missing. One glance in the direction of the small chest of drawers was enough. It was obviously gone. "The one person who really wanted it badly was Wyndham Spencer James," Anne Davies said. Gwendraeth didn't reply for a moment. He knew Wyndham Spencer James and his appetites, and he knew he wouldn't do anything as obvious as breaking and entering in order to get what he wanted. When he said this to Anne Davies, he couldn't be sure she was taking everything in. She looked at him as he spoke and followed his movements, but the sense of extra connection that they had previously experienced was missing. "Don't touch anything. We'll get the fingerprint boys in," he said, reaching for his mobile, while at the same time he knew that they probably wouldn't find anything. Whoever had done this knew enough to do a clean job. This was no amateur. When he had finished on the phone, he went into the kitchen and made Anne Davies a pot of tea and put plenty of sugar in her cup. He didn't say anything as she sat there and drank the tea almost without expression. He looked after her as best he could until it was time for her to leave to start her shift at the hospital. He sat there after she'd left, and unusually for him, drank the rest of the pot of tea. A little while later, when the fingerprint boys, Dewi Evans and a trainee who he didn't know, arrived, he left them to it. On the way back to the station, he arranged for a local female officer, Alison Crandall, to call in later in the day. Then he drove back to his office, trying to make sense of it all. Harry Warden was standing outside the main building enjoying a rare cigarette when Gwendraeth drove into the car park and found a place. He knew what that meant. Warden was feeling pleased with himself. He'd given up smoking just over a year ago, and now only allowed himself the occasional luxury when he'd done something of which he was particularly proud. "Well," Gwendraeth said a few moments later, standing by the side of Harry Warden and taking care the wind wasn't blowing in his direction. "Well, what?" Gwendraeth knew that Harry Warden wasn't going to make it easy for him. His sergeant stood there, smoking even more slowly than he usually did, looking as if he held the answer to the world's problems between two outstretched fingers. "What did you find out?" Harry Warden took a deep drag and let the smoke out slowly. Taking his time, he said, "I found the place Anne Davies' mother went to." "And?" "A home for unmarried mothers outside Leeds," Harry Warden said. Then he looked regretfully at the butt of his cigarette, took one last pull of it, and threw it to the ground, where he ground it under his heel. "Did you find out what happened to the baby?" "Better than that. I found the adopted mother." "I think it was the baby that was adopted, Warden, not the mother." "Don't get picky on me, Chief. Not now," Harry Warden said. Then, telling Gwendraeth that he wanted to show him his notes, he led the way back into the building. A few hours later, Gwendraeth crossed the border between England and Wales, somewhere near Ross-on-Wye, and followed the motorway north, mixing easily with the early afternoon traffic, riding high and easy, with muddy waters blasting out a devastating rhythm from the speakers at the back of the car. It was the second time in a week that he'd gone back to this particular version of "I've got my mojo working." And now, with his foot down and his speed steady, he felt he was heading for a breakthrough in the complex, interlocking series of events that surrounded the deaths of Queenie Rogers and Henrietta James. Before he left, he told Harry Warden about the Anne Davies breaking, about the missing Scrimshaw skeleton, and the fact that an attempt at a second shooting had taken place. He'd given the sergeant detailed instructions about looking after Anne Davies and Samantha Merriam, and about how to cover for him if Chief Superintendent Harding began asking awkward questions. He knew that he was taking a chance in making this journey without any kind of official sanction, but he also knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't make it at all. It was a village bounded at both ends by bridges, one of them of traditional stone with a humpback, the other a more concrete and steel construction that had obviously replaced something older. On one side of the river, where he now was, the land rose in a series of stone terraces, with houses clinging to the narrow flat spaces, as if one slip would invite disaster. These were not Welsh houses, Gwendraeth noticed immediately. They were built of a finer cut grey stone whose edges were darkened by age and industry. There was an unfamiliar sternness about them. Their uncompromising stand facing the hill opposite where the land rose in a series of gentler folds indicated a no-nonsense toughness, only slightly mitigated by bright white paintwork and hooks for hanging seasonal flower baskets. The address he wanted was in the middle terrace, where a series of slightly newer houses, but built in the same style as the others, dominated a clear space in the otherwise packed terrace, with a ribbon of stone-studded tarmac in front of them. They offered a clear view over the river and to the hills on the other side, where the remains of a stone furnace or beam engine house gave indications of a now crumbled prosperity. When Gwendraeth got out of the car, he immediately noticed the harsh dampness of the climate. Living here would be a rigorous experience, he thought, as he walked across the road to the end house, which announced its presence in a strange litany of PVC windows. He rang the doorbell, and the door was opened almost immediately by a smallish, dark-haired woman in a blue nylon housecoat, who, although she could scarcely be in her mid-60s, reminded Gwendraeth of his Aunt Elsie's generation. In response to an inquisitive cock of her head, Gwendraeth told her who he was and held up his identification. It seemed to him that she nodded back at him with a resigned air, almost as if she'd been expecting trouble even before he'd said anything. "You are Mrs. Elena Wellmacott?" he asked, as she ushered him into an overstuffed front room, where a large patterned sofa and 2 armchairs competed for attention with a different patterned carpet and curtains, and a large wall unit displaying the kind of plaster ornaments often given away as prizes in fairground shooting contests. "No one's called me that for years, love," the bird-like woman said to him. "Been married again since then. Both my husbands are gone now." She indicated a series of small framed photographs on the bottom shelf of the wall unit. Gwendraeth went over and looked at them, and sure enough, Elena Wellmacott was clinging to 2 different men in different photographs. The first showed her on the arm of a portly, silver-haired man in a white short-sleeved shirt that was too small for him. The second featured her with a shorter man who was holding a pipe with a curved stem. Despite the obviously warm climate, he insisted on wearing a cardigan. Both photos seemed to have been taken in the same holiday resort in Spain or somewhere. "Torremolinos," she said, without Gwendraeth having to ask. "I always go there. The weather is reliable and the food unremarkable. It's very good value for money." The remark indicated a native shrewdness about Elena Wellmacott, lately known as Archer, that was confirmed by the remainder of Gwendraeth's interview with her. When he asked her a question, she answered in a flat, no-nonsense manner that indicated a distaste for unnecessary narrative. "You moved here from Leeds after you adopted your son," Gwendraeth said. It was a statement rather than a question. He knew the details from the file that Harry Warden had assembled over the last day or so. The remark was a politeness intended to get the woman in front of him to open up, if she was willing. "After I adopted both of them," Elena Wellmacott said, fiddling with the knob on the gas fire and turning it on. As the heat flowed in the already overstuffed room, Gwendraeth couldn't help feeling some rising nausea. He got up and opened the lounge door, letting in some cold air from the hall. "You have to be careful if you're that sensitive," Elena Wellmacott told him without any hesitation. "I was always telling my daughter Doris that. She was a highly strung child, beautiful she was, small. I suppose that's why she was always getting into trouble." "What kind of trouble?" It was an instinctive question for Gwendraeth, part of his professionalism. "I thought first that's what you'd come about," Elena Wellmacott said. "I thought it had all flared up again, all that shoplifting and the trouble with the stolen needles. I thought, what a pity, just as she was settling down with that accountant from Harrogate. He likes her well enough. He's older and he's stable. It does her good." You weren't expecting me to ask about your son? Him? He's no trouble, is he? He's quiet and he's well ordered, and I hardly ever see him. I did have a Christmas card last year, I admit. That's about all. He doesn't like writing, he says. Too busy. And he doesn't like the phone either. He's too reserved, he is. She paused for a moment and looked directly at Gwendraeth, as if she was serious about what she was going to say next. Sometimes I get envious, when I hear about people contacting their relatives by computer. Sometimes I begin to wonder if, despite myself, I did something wrong. And did you? It's not for me to say, is it? It's hardly my job. After all, you can't expect me to be my own social worker now, can you? For a second time, Gwendraeth was struck by Elena Wellmacott's native shrewdness. She was obviously someone with an active intelligence capable of quickly anticipating the next move in a conversation. The most you can do is what you can, Elena Wellmacott continued. But you don't need me to tell you that, do you? You're a policeman. If Gwendraeth could not follow the exact course of her logic at that moment, he could be forgiven when his attention strayed. The smallish room, with its competing rather than complementary colours and textures, seemed to be at odds with the otherwise closely ordered nature of Elena Wellmacott's personality. As if she sensed this, she said, Ernie and I, that's my first husband, do you understand, had trouble conceiving. That's why we decided to adopt. Doris was the first. She was such a bright, happy child in the beginning, no trouble at all, that we decided to go back for another one. And that's how we got William. William? Oh, he doesn't call himself that now, does he? Much too reticent to be anything ordinary, like a William or a Bill. It was the army that changed him. He was quite nice and ordinary before then. But all that special training and sneaking about at night with burnt cork in his face or whatever it is they use, that changed him, that did. He started off quiet and he ended up as almost reclusive, I'd say. Do you have a photograph? I need to be sure we're talking about the same person. I suppose I do somewhere, Elena Wellmacott said. But she made no move to show him one. Gwendraeth decided to insist. Too much was at stake. May I see you one now? He said. There was no mistaking his tone. Elena Wellmacott's attitude changed. She placed both hands on the arms of her chair before she got up. Is he in trouble? She said. I don't know yet. Gwendraeth told the absolute truth as he saw it. As far as he was concerned, there was no need to tell her everything. He watched as Elena Wellmacott got herself out of the chair and moved slowly over to the dark stained wall unit that flanked the fireplace. Careful not to disturb the motley collection of plaster figures, which ranged from a red-coated soldier to a drum with a squat, large-headed dog of dubious proportions, she opened the cupboard beneath the shelves that held the figurines, and then lifted out a dark red leatherette album that actually said Snapshots in fake gilt cursive handwriting on the cover. She came back towards him. Gwendraeth had an uneasy moment when he thought perhaps he was wrong. What if, after all this, his intuition was not correct? That Elena Wellmacott's adopted son had nothing to do with anything that he'd been investigating? What if his whole journey had been nothing but a wild goose chase? What if, a little while later, when Elena Wellmacott handed him the photo album and showed him the place that she wanted him to look, all Gwendraeth's doubts vanished. But it didn't make him feel much better. He was in the SAS. he said, looking up from the album. I don't know what you call it. It was his business. He was trained to handle special missions. I suppose so, yes, Elena Wellmacott said. But it changed him, you know. He was never the same afterwards. A short time later, Gwendraeth James was back in his car outside Elena Wellmacott's house, trying to get a signal on his mobile to get in touch with Harry Warden. No good. His battery was fine, but the hills in front and behind were in the way. He glanced at his watch as he put the car in gear and headed towards the motorway. It was still just before 6 o'clock. With any luck, he could be back in Miserbont by about 10. He needed to be. He needed to be there as soon as possible to prevent another attack. What he had just found out had convinced him that was more than a possibility. He hoped he would be in time.